Welcome, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the second event in our speaker series for the 2024-25 academic year. My name is David Glasgow. I'm the Executive Director of the Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion and Belonging. And for this event, I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished guest, Eboo Patel. Eboo is the founder and president of Interfaith America, the nation's premier interfaith organization. He's also the author of numerous books, including Acts of Faith, The Story of an American Muslim in the Struggle for the Soul of a Generation, Interfaith Leadership, a primer, and his most recent book that is the subject of today's conversation, We Need to Build, Field Notes for Diverse Democracy. Eboo served on President Obama's inaugural advisory council on faith-based and religious partnerships, and he's been an Ashoka Fellow since 2004. And he holds a doctorate in the sociology of religion from Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. And we are thrilled that he's joined us here today. Toward the end of today's program, I will open up for Q&A, so please make sure to submit any questions that you have through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So if we could just stop sharing the screen and we'll continue the conversation. Great. So Eboo, welcome, first of all, to our speaker series.
David, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. It is obviously a sensitive and kind of crossroads moment for diversity work, and we're on the field. So here we go. We're gonna do the best we can, and we're gonna move the ball forward.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. I couldn't think of a better person to speak to at this time. And so I want to really start with how you open the book, We Need to Build, with a distinction that you draw between two forms of social change or ways of engaging in activism. The first one seeks primarily to expose structures of injustice, and the second one seeks to construct a more just society. So the first one is about critique, protest, opposition, and disruption. The second is about building bridges and building civic institutions. So can you share a bit more about this distinction and explain why it is that you think that second form of social change is important for us not to neglect?
Sure. The second form being actually building things that are better.
Yes.
You mean? Yeah. So what I open my book, We Need to Build, with a couple of lines that basically say social change is not principally about a more ferocious revolution. It's principally about building a better social order. And building something is hard. Building things is hard. And part of the reason we go to college and part of the reason that we work in professional capacities is to learn the skills to build things. And I think that social change agents need to principally be about building things that are better, particularly if they have the privilege of being part of the 1/3 of the United States with a college degree and part of the very small percentage of the United States with an elite college degree. I think if you have the privilege of having been involved in the amazing sector that is American higher education, you should primarily be a builder, and you should defeat the things you do not love by building the things you do. What does the better school look like? What does the better approach to public safety look like? What is the better approach to diversity in law firms or in banks or in universities look like? What does good look like? That is what we're responsible for building, and we're encouraging people to follow.
Great. And so I want to, apply that really to the topic that I'm sure is on the mind of many of the people attending today, which is the results of last week's presidential election. So your book is about, building just and inclusive civic institutions. But, one of the things I worry about right now is that one of the biggest fault lines in politics seems to be how people relate to institutions, whether they're pro-institution or anti-institution. So, of course, Kamala Harris, her coalition included pro-institution, disaffected Republicans, people like Liz Cheney. And then Donald Trump, his coalition included anti-institution, disaffected Democrats like Tulsi Gabbard. So how do you get people to see the importance of building these robust institutions when there's such profound, widespread cynicism and distrust of institutions out there in the American electorate?
So virtually everybody on this Zoom has done well in institutions. Virtually everybody in this room has done well in institutions. And it is the responsibility of those of us who have done well in institutions to improve those institutions for other people. And I think that the crossroads here is mobility and cooperation. In order to have a successful society, a successful, diverse democracy, what we need is institutions that encourage people to cooperate across their differences to lift people up. I think college campuses are an exceptional place to practice that. We, at college campuses, we gather people from diverse identities and divergent ideologies, and we learn how to cooperate across our differences so that everybody can thrive. And I think one of the challenges of the past few years is that some of the people who have done best in our society claim to be doing the worst. And my sense is that that is actually quite maddening to folks who have seen their real wages drop, that are downwardly mobile, et cetera, et cetera. People who see a college degree required signs everywhere, and that is 2/3 of the country sees college degree required signs everywhere. And that is a sign that says, you can't be here. You can't be here. So for those of us who have done well in the system, it is our job to build a better system so that other people can do well. And if you're at the tippy top of that system, something like 3% of students in the United States go to highly selective colleges. Those are colleges that with an admission rate of less than 20%. If you are in that 3% of college students, you're in the upper 3% of the upper third of the country. What that means is you have a responsibility to everybody else. I remember when my book first came out, We Need to Build, it was at a particularly cynical time in the professional, highly educated classes in the United States. It was a couple of years ago. And there was a journalist who said to me, people like me don't trust institutions. And I probably heard a dozen versions of that in interviews I'd done for my book at that time. And something in me kind of snapped. I'm a mild and mellow guy, so when I snap, it's mild and mellow. So when I said, "Hey man, where'd you learn how to swim? Did somebody just throw you in an ocean and say make it back to shore, or did you learn to swim at a YMCA or a Jewish community center or a park district that somebody 100 years ago built, and that somebody else donates to, and that somebody else gives of their Saturday morning to volunteer at?" I think it's really important to have a general attitude that says, I'm grateful for what I have. I'm thankful to the people who helped me get here. It's my job to do the best I can and to lift as I climb. That's the attitude that those of us who are fortunate enough to be in the educated and professional classes should have. In a nation that, I will say again, 2/3 of people do not have a college degree. The vast majority of people who do have a college degree go to colleges that are virtually open admission. If you go to a selective college, you graduate, your job is to lift as you climb.
And so you, of course, implement the principles that you espouse, and you've done that by being the founder and president of Interfaith America. So I'd love if you could share just a little bit about the work that you do at Interfaith America, so that we can all have a kind of concrete example of what building a civic institution looks like.
Sure. And I'll tell you actually the origin story of the organization, David, because it kind of perfectly exemplifies these first couple of questions you've asked me. So my first years in activism were kind of raise your fist at other people activism. I was very good at telling other people what they were doing wrong. That's what I specialized in. Very good at telling other people what they were doing wrong. And I started getting interested in religious diversity issues and interfaith issues, in large part because people of faith have built really powerful social movements for social change, whether that's abolition or Hind Swaraj in India, or the struggle in South Africa, or the civil rights movement. As I came to know more about the movements that I admired the most, I realized the central role that people of diverse faiths working together played in those movements. And so I started going to interfaith conferences to learn more, to basically do to be involved in the current generation's work in that way. And I would stand up at these interfaith conferences and I would shout from the seats during plenary sessions, and I would say, "You're so boring. This is terrible. Where are the young people? Where's the edge? Where's the Vanguard energy? I was calling people out. I was calling people out. And at one of these conferences in June of 1998, a conference at Stanford University, after I called this set of people out who were standing on the stage, this woman came up to me afterwards and she said to me, you know, the idea that you have of an interfaith movement that would have young people at the center, that would be about social action, that would have a lot of energy, that's a great idea. Why are you criticizing other people for not doing it? Why don't you build that yourself? And that's the beginning of the organization that I started. This woman challenging me and saying, why are you so good at telling other people what they're doing wrong? You seem like a smart person. Why don't you do that yourself? And it was actually a moment of kind of deep reflection, because the truth is my self-righteousness was a bluff. And my deep fear was, can I actually do what I tell other people they're not doing? Could I do it myself? And I kind of had to get around to the fact that I needed to take up this challenge. I needed to take up this challenge. It was not enough to just tell other people what they're doing wrong. And I've now been doing this for 25 years. And the big idea of the organization is that religious diversity is a hugely important part of the American experiment. It's the dimension of identity and diversity that the European founders of the 1776 generation came closest to getting right. It is a central part of our civil society, the largest provider of social services in America after the federal government are organizations like the Salvation Army and Catholic Charities. You cannot imagine a disaster without faith-based disaster relief organizations. You can't imagine your city without the presence of faith-based institutions like hospitals, universities, and social service organizations. So what if we encouraged those kinds of institutions from diverse faith communities to work positively with each other? And what if we worked with college campuses and civic organizations and companies to encourage cooperation across difference with attention to religious diversity? It's interesting. Religion is, by orders of magnitude, the single most important part of identity in American law, from the Constitution to the Civil Rights Act to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993 to recent Supreme Court rulings. Easily the single most important identity in American law, and unfortunately, the dimension of identity least paid attention to in campus and corporate diversity programs. So we seek to be a corrective for that, to be a diversity organization that pays attention to religious diversity, as well as doing cooperation across difference to lift everybody up. And so I actually have a quick slide that just kind of shows the map of the organization. So we're one of America's largest diversity organizations. We have 80 professional staff all around the country, organizations based in Chicago. We work with companies, work with campuses, we work with civic organizations. We've written a number of books, and the centerpiece of the organization is to inspire, equip, and connect leaders and institutions to unlock the potential of America's religious diversity and other dimensions of diversity in these three key sectors.
Great, thank you so much, Ibu. And I do want to come back shortly to this question of religion and how it relates to the field of DEI and why it's been neglected. But before I do that, I want to ask you one more question about the election, which I think is all that people have been speaking with me about, certainly for the past week, which is that many of the people that we work with at our center, deeply fear another Trump term and what it might mean for, their communities or the communities that they care about. And during his first term, one of the catch cries that his opponents would throw out there was the word resist or resistance, right? So what would you say to someone who thinks, that all this talk about building bridges and building institutions sounds great in, normal times, but we're in a crisis and what we really need now is mass protest, mass resistance, mass condemnation, that it's about fighting rather than about building right now?
Yeah, so I think it's important to reckon with some facts. Jeff Bezos says, reality is an undefeated champion. So here are some uncomfortable facts. Donald Trump been very insulting to Native Americans and called Elizabeth Warren Pocahontas, on and on and on. He won Native American the swing in Native American counties in Trump's favor was 10 points. So the person who insults Native Americans vis-a-vis the party who embraces diversity, 10-point swing. Donald Trump is, of course, famous for all kinds of insulting things towards Latinos, building the wall, Mexican immigrants as rapists, floating island of garbage, Puerto Rico. The swing to Donald Trump in Latino majority districts, 13 points. Donald Trump, in all the newspapers I read, and I think that's an important part of this, all the newspapers I read in my kind of echo chamber, the New York Times, the Washington Post, et cetera, famously feuds with lots of Black leaders. John Lewis calls majority Black cities all kinds of awful things. The swing towards Donald Trump in majority Black districts, 3 points. So how does the party that embraces diversity lose ethnic minorities to somebody we view as racist and sexist? Pause and reflect for a long time. And I don't think there has been any lack of resistance in the last 10 years. The symbol for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1960, when it was launched, were two hands joined together, a black hand and a white hand. Of course, many people who were connected to the white hand didn't really want to cooperate back in 1960. But the strategy of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee under John Lewis and Diane Nash was, we are going to widen the welcome, even for people who have attitudes that we find offensive, and we're going to persuade you into living in a new country. And that's not the social change symbol of our time. The social change symbol of our time is the fist. My sense is there's not been any lack of the fist in the last 10 years. My sense is that scorn is not a good strategy. And when you live in a democracy, you have to persuade people. You have to persuade people. I'm not sure that those of us who believe in the beauty of diversity, believe that diversity is a treasure, have been great at persuading people. And it's striking that the very people we say we represent and stand for move towards Donald Trump in meaningful numbers. Reality is an undefeated champion. It's important to look it square in the face.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, because I think now is such an important time for those of us who are doing DEI work to engage in that kind of self-reflection. And you have published critiques of DEI, arguing that we need to take a hard look at what's working and what isn't in the field, and urging DEI folks to adopt a posture of learning. So let me adopt that posture of learning right now and ask you directly, as you look at the field of DEI work, the work that people are doing in this area, what's working and what isn't? What does the DEI movement need to do differently?
Yeah, so I'll begin with a personal story, and then I'll get into some social science data. But maybe I'll kind of open it with this idea that there's actually good social science data on the kind of diversity programs that work over 40 years. So what I'm going to present in a moment here is not a secret. Is not a secret. The books that are written on this are by professors at Michigan, by the chair of the sociology department at Harvard. So we've had some version of diversity programs in America since the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And social scientists have studied what works over 40 years. And there is a clear consensus that there's a kind of diversity work that works, and there's a kind that doesn't work. If your goal is to increase the representation of women and minorities in your organization. If your goal is to overthrow capitalism, that's something else. I'm being quite serious about that, right? So if you have started a DEI function at your university or your company in order to increase the number of female partners at your law firm or African-American partners at your consulting company, there are strategies which are known to have worked. Right. But let me do a personal story before getting into some of those strategies, and then connect these two things. So back in the early 2000s, roughly between 2000 2003, 2004, when I first got married, and 2014 or 2015, I used to tell this story of my father-in-law at my wedding. My father-in-law is not much of a public speaker. It's very uncomfortable standing up there, shifting, from one foot to another. But he wants to tell this story of coming to the United States with less than $100 in his pocket from India. There's a Muslim living in a village in India, a marginalized minority in India, from a place where he didn't have shoes until he was 12 years old. Comes to this country with less than $100, goes to SUNY Buffalo, becomes an engineer, and raises a family and has a successful career. Happens to have worked at housing authorities, where he's very proud to have been involved in building housing for the less fortunate in America. He is very committed to lifting as he climbed. And he says, I had 4 daughters, one of whom I married. One is in education, one is in medicine, one is in philanthropy, one is in law. That's my wife. And my father-in-law says, I don't think this could have been possible in any country but America. And so he takes pride in his progress, and he connects it with the progress of the nation. And I used to tell that story over and over and over again. It felt very fitting for the Obama era, right? That part of what's in your identity, you take in your identity is this pride, and you connect it to progress. Yeah, I'm proud of being from India. I'm proud of being Muslim, and I'm proud of how that identity has inspired me to work hard and to get ahead. And there have been challenges, but I've surmounted those challenges and I've gotten ahead. That was my father-in-law's story. I used to tell it all the time. And around 2014, 2015, people in the spaces I was in didn't really want to hear it anymore. And this literally occurred to me in the last week. Like, I thought to myself, as I looked at the data about ethnic minorities and how they voted, and then looked at some of the deeper data about how ethnic minorities are actually way more patriotic, and they say they value hard work far more than some other demographics in the country. And I thought to myself, I haven't told a story about my father-in-law for 10 years, because the circles that I'm in would say, you're not talking about white supremacy enough. You're not talking about institutionalized racism enough. But I'm thinking to myself, but I'm taking pride in my progress, and I'm connecting it to the progress of the nation. And I want to help other people rise up too. I don't want to tell a story about how all of the things that are arrayed against me are going to be more powerful than my belief in my own identity and potential. And I think what's interesting about the Echelon Insights survey data about ethnic minorities is large percentages of African Americans and Latinos say that to surveyors. We take pride in our identity. We take pride in hard work. We take pride in our nation. We connect all of those things. And I think part of what's interesting is that is a minority view in lots of spaces that are about diversity. But if we're cooperating and lifting up, if we're working together so that everybody can thrive, you have to have pride in your identity. You have to take pride in progress. And you have to take pride in helping other people progress. And we actually know how to do this well. We actually know how to do this well. So I want to put up this slide.
Shirley, would you be able to share the slide? Just one moment.
Yep. So when this comes up, it will show a couple of categories of the social science data on this, on, again, what we know works when it comes to diversity work. And I'll just mention some of the data points as we get the slide up. Here it is. So I'm drawing this from a book called Getting to Diversity by Frank Dobbins and Alexandra Kalev, and also Scott Page's Diversity Bonus. So here's what works when it comes to diversity work. The idea that diversity benefits everybody, that there are no losers in diversity work. It benefits everybody. There is a diversity bonus. The theme that we cooperate together to lift people up. So in other words, what these social scientists did is they studied diversity programs that had these themes. This training is about benefiting everybody. Nobody's gonna have to call themselves a white supremacist. Nobody's gonna have to call themselves a misogynist. Whoever you are, be proud of your identity, lift everybody up. And the strategies that work when it comes to diversifying a company, recruit from diverse places. Go to Harvard, but also go to Howard, right? Go to Morehouse, go to Spelman. Diverse teams engaging common problems, that helps diversity. Creating mentoring across lines of difference, that helps diversity. What do all of these things have in common? This idea that when we cooperate together, we lift everybody up. There's no losers here. What doesn't work? So in these books, it is demonstrated that a number of diversity trainings have been found to activate bias instead of decreasing it. What activates bias? Anything around shame and guilt. Anything around shame and guilt. Anything that feels coerced or punishment related. Anything that over relies on grievance. When those themes show up in a diversity training, it leads to fewer female partners at the law firm. It leads to fewer African American and Latino partners at the consulting firm. 40 years of social science. It is not a secret what works and what doesn't work. Now, what's interesting is, I'll just tell a story. So I was presenting this to a group of partners at law firms and judges in Chicago a few weeks ago. Everybody's super interested in this, like literally law firm partners raise their hands and they're like, hey, so listen, you're telling me I can dramatically reduce the grievance procedures at my law firm. We'll do what's legally required, but we're going to stop all this other stuff. And I can tell my people, we're going to recruit at Howard, we're going to recruit at law schools that have significant numbers of African Americans. And we're going to start a mentoring program. So we're going to stop doing stuff that doesn't work and we're going to start doing stuff that does work. And he's like working his way through this. He's basically like, this is a solvable problem, right? And I'm like, yeah, this is a solvable problem. You can do this. It's not a secret. And I see somebody in the room fidgeting, does not like what I'm saying. And finally, she raises her hand and she's the person, the DEI person that's been hired by this group of corporate law partners and judges to increase diversity in the legal profession in Chicago. And she says, nothing that you're saying is going to undo capitalism. And there's just dead silence in the room. Because the judges and law firm partners are like, we're not looking to undo capitalism. We're looking to diversify the judicial bench in our law firms. So that's a question, right? I am a huge supporter of DEI. I think of DEI as a container. What is the content in the container? We know that there's certain content that gets to the goal. Cooperation gets to the goal. Mentoring gets to the goal. Working together on common problems gets to the goal. Other things don't get to the goal. The interesting question is the content in your diversity function, is what it wants to do actually diversify the organization, or does it want to do something else?
Yeah. So thank you so much for that. And you mentioned persuasion as being a really important factor that pro DEI folks need to get better at doing, given that we're losing so many people who might otherwise support the values that we're espousing. So are there any sort of strategies, messages, arguments that you have found to be persuasive to people who are otherwise potentially skeptical of DEI? So we hear all the time, for example, from folks who will say, well, why aren't we just, making all these decisions based on merit? And isn't it unfair to even strive for this goal that we're talking about because of that? Or isn't it better to just ignore all of these group differences, whether that be religion or gender or what have you? Are there arguments that you have found effective in bringing people over to support these ideas?
Yeah, if we could put that slide back up very quickly. Thanks, Shirley. So I want to read the top there. These are the lines that I close all of my speeches with. Diversity is a treasure. Identity is a source of pride. Cooperation is better than division. Faith is a bridge. Everybody is a contributor. Okay. Diversity is a treasure. Identity is a source of pride. Cooperation is better than division. Faith is a bridge. Everybody is a contributor. So doesn't matter where I'm at. If I'm in an evangelical church in rural Indiana, or if I'm at NYU, that line gets vigorous nodding. And part of what we learn from, for example, the recent survey by Rui Teixeira and Yuval Levin, is that there's actually a majority of America that embraces diversity. 59% of America say diversity is a positive thing. The question is, are you going to lean into the kind of positive, constructive dimension of that, right? Like, can we make it inspiring? And one of the things I like to, one of the things I talk about a lot is the notion of a potluck as a metaphor, right? A potluck is a beautiful way to think about diversity work, because the thing that a potluck requires is contributions. You believe that everybody's a contributor. Now you recognize that it's easier for some people to make their contribution than other people. Some people have lavish kitchens and a ready transportation, and other people have small kitchens and they got to take the train. But you never say to anybody, hey, I know you are too destitute to contribute something to the potluck. That's actually really insulting. It actually dignifies people's identity to think of them as contributors. Everybody is a contributor. And by the way, you want a diversity of people contributing to your potluck. You don't want everybody to just bring casserole. You don't want everybody to just bring biryani, as much as I love biryani. You don't want everybody to just bring hummus, as much as I love hummus. You want a diversity of people bringing their best dish inspired by their distinctive identities. And the challenge of the host of the potluck is to figure out how to create a space where those dishes can be in creative combination and those people can be in enriching conversation. And that's what a good law firm is. That's what a good bank is. That's what a good university is. A good institution is a place that is like a potluck, where people feel inspired to bring their best dish, inspired by their identity, to a common table where there can be creative combinations and enriching conversations. And by the way, that's not just a cool metaphor, it's also borne out by the social science literature, that it is better for organizations. This is the idea of the diversity bonus by Scott Page, right? You have different cognitive repertoires, different identities, because people of different identities have different experiences. They come into a space with different cognitive repertoires, and that ultimately helps a company if it can be facilitated in a cooperative way. So we know this is helpful. You don't want everybody thinking the same way. You don't want everybody from the same identity, but you cannot have one group of people self-righteously calling another group of people the great unwashed because they don't use the right language all the time. That is scornful. That is self-righteous. That does not work.
And so can I pick up on another critique that you made of DEI earlier, which is about religion and about the fact that religion is, the deepest source of identity for so many and such a fundamental component of American law, and yet is sidelined, ignored, hardly discussed at all in the field of DEI. Why do you think that is? And what could DEI practitioners and advocates be doing to better incorporate discussions of religion into DEI?
Yeah, so let me just kind of begin with kind of an interesting fact base here, right? The United States is the most religiously diverse nation in human history, the most religiously devout nation in the Western Hemisphere. In a nation in which religious identity is the most important dimension of identity in law. The importance of religion, it's just, you cannot overstate it, okay? If every faith-based institution in your city, New York City, were to close overnight and you took a walk in the morning, there would be many fewer hospitals, universities, virtually no social service agencies, except for ones that are government run, far fewer civic organizations. What's the C in the YMCA? It's Christian, right? So again, part of my point is that it is impossible to overstate the influence of religion in our society, just in a concrete way, just in like the institutions built by religious communities. Robert Putnam, the great sociologist, says that religion is at least half of American social capital, probably closer to 70%. And it is virtually ignored in diversity spaces. In fact, my organization, Interfaith America, did a study called Ideals about diversity in college campuses. And part of what we learned was that over 60% of college students said they spend a lot of time discussing issues like trans issues, race, nationality, ethnicity, gender. Super important, all of it. I wish that number was 99%. But fewer than 50% of college students said they spent any time talking about religion. But if you go work for a human services organization, unless it's run by the government, 4 out of 5 times it's going to be founded by a faith community. So why do so many people in DEI, by the way, I want to keep on saying this. I am a strong proponent of the goals of DEI and of the container that is DEI. The question is, what's the content within it? Is the content oppressor versus oppressed? I think that that's the wrong way to go. It's the content we cooperate across our differences to lift everybody up. I think that's the right way to go. The question is, what's the content? And I think that the reason that religion is not engaged in many DEI spaces has nothing to do with the importance of religion, and has everything to do with the particular worldviews of people in DEI spaces.
You mean the disproportionate sort of secularism of people?
I don't think it's, I don't think there, so the organization that I lead proudly, Interfaith America, we have we're one of the largest diversity organizations in the country. We have 80 full-time professional staff, and I would say a third of our staff is secular. So it's not necessarily about personal orientation. It is about it's about the importance you accord to other people's identities, right? And so, I speak in medical school sometimes, and I do a talk on the importance of religious identity. In fact, we have an excellent program area called Faith and Health, which my terrific colleague Dr. Suzanne Henderson leads. It's a program that works with colleges to help their future health practitioners engage religious diversity better in health settings. And part of what I say when I speak in medical schools, and Dr. Henderson also when she speaks in medical schools, is, hey, listen, I think it is wonderful if you are inspired by your faith to be a healer. Many of you are. Many of you are. That's wonderful. But you know what's more important than your inspiration? What your patients think. That's what's more important. So if your patient says, as a Muslim, I really need to pray my tasbih for 2 hours a day. If you roll your eyes or are scornful of that, you're just a bad doctor. If your patient thinks it's important, if your employee thinks it's important, lecturing them about how oppressive religion has been in history is not a best practice, certainly not a tool of persuasion. It is a tool of scorn.
So Ibu, you've given us so much to think about, and I want to remind the participants to please submit any questions that you have in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I see there are also already some great questions, and I will get to some of them shortly. But I want to just ask you one more question, Ibu, before we close, which is that in your book, you note that in a democracy, you have to live with the people that you defeat. And of course, we also have to live with the people who defeat us as well.
Yep.
And that task seems increasingly hard in a country where divisions run very deep on issues that are incredibly important to many people, and often the stakes for people feel existential. So let me close with a very simple question for you, which is, how do we learn to live with the people that we defeat, and indeed also with the people who defeat us?
So I am a big believer in Mandela on this. I'm a big believer in Martin Luther King Jr. on this. I'm a big believer in Jane Addams and the Prophet Muhammad on this. And a big part of that is this sense that everybody has a better self, and it is my job to help bring that out. So if in an interaction, if you're being a jerk, I'm doing something wrong. And honestly, that's the way I was raised. And I'm proud of that part of my identity. I'm proud of the part of my identity in which my parents said to me, the interactions you are engaged in are mostly your responsibility because you're so privileged. I was raised with the idea that I was privileged. Being an Ismaili Muslim is a form of privilege. Being an Indian immigrant is a form of privilege. And if you have that privilege, particularly if you have the privilege of being book smart in a knowledge society, it is your responsibility to create spaces where people can be their better selves. And so I think we have an opportunity to do that. I think we have an opportunity to do that in our campuses. I think we have an opportunity to do that in civil society. I think we have an opportunity to do that in politics. It's one of the reasons I was so attracted to Obama, because he said, look, we're so decent to each other in our little leagues and our PTAs. At least we were 15 years ago. What if we brought that into our politics? I'm a believer in that. I'm a believer in that. I saw Mandela speak in 1999. And I thought to myself, looking at him, thought to myself, you learned the names of your jailers' kids on Robben Island because you thought you had the privilege of being on the right side of history, and you were going to treat people with a sense of dignity. And they changed. They changed. And so I actually love that responsibility. I love that responsibility. And I love, I think of, when I think of my minority identity, I just think of it as a privilege. And when I send my kids to college, I want the DEI function at that college to be robust and well-funded. And I want those professionals to look at my kids and say, what inspires you about Islam? What is a privilege about your identity? And when you act in that manner, you make us all better. And I don't really want them to say, how are you a victim of Islamophobia? Islamophobia exists, it's ugly. But mostly being a Muslim is about being inspired by Islam, not being a victim of Islamophobia. And when we think about pride and privilege and progress, I think we all do better.
So I think that's a lovely note to then lead into the audience Q&A. And I want to pick up on a question that someone's asked about how much of this is really about gender. And so I think here we're talking about some of the dynamics around, you mentioned racial and ethnic minority groups, some of them shifting significantly toward Trump in this most recent election. Of course, prior to the election, there were predictions that there would be this massive gaping gender gap that seems not to have occurred, at least not as significant as was predicted prior to the election. Nonetheless, there do seem to be some gender dynamics going on here, especially among younger men, young Gen Z men who are, turning against some of what we might call loosely DEI. How do you think about the role of gender in these conversations and specifically reaching young men?
Yeah, I mean, look, the real question is about was there sexism and misogyny? And I just don't think there's any doubt about that. Of course there was, 100% there was. And just I just want to say, like, I just thought Kamala Harris I just think she did a great job. That doesn't mean every strategic move was right, but I just thought she came across as, she's so smart, she's so warm. I think she's so funny. I find her relatable. I think she did a great job, and I think that there were lots of headwinds, and sexism was an issue. There's no doubt about it. So that is a fact, right? And part of what those of us who are book smart in the knowledge economy do is we look at a range of facts. So let's look at some other facts. In the early 1970s, 57% of the people in college were men and 43% were women. And we looked at that as a nation and said, this is wrong. And we instituted a law called Title IX to increase the opportunities for women. And we called it what it was, which was patriarchy and misogyny. And now in 2024, the number is reversed. 57% of the people in college are women and 43% are men. 2/3 of the people at the bottom of their eighth grade classes are men, boys. There's a wild discrepancy between the suicide rates of boys and girls. And so the point that I'm making is many facts can be true. One fact that is true is that there's ugly sexism and misogyny in our society, and we had a presidential candidate who, I'll say it again, I personally liked a lot, who faced that. And another fact that's true is, as far as people under 30 years old, I'm not talking about, the partners at corporate law firms, right? I'm talking about how people under 30 are doing, and actually all the way up to 60 or 70 that are not in the professional classes. Boys are doing terribly. And so it's an interesting question. If when there is a discrepancy amongst how boys and girls are doing, we say we've built a system around boys, as in the early 70s, when it is just clear on so many stats that girls are doing better than boys. And again, it's just a fact. These are just facts. These are just facts. Okay. Suicide rates, academic performance, et cetera, et cetera. Can we say that there's a system, at least in education, that's been built around girls? Remember, I have two sons. One of them came home one day and said, why do the boys get into trouble for things that girls don't get into trouble for? So if you're in 7th grade, I guess I could have explained to him how patriarchy works, and patriarchy exists and it's ugly. But he's not wrong when he says, why do boys get into trouble for things that girls don't get into trouble for?
So Ibu, can I, ask, there's another question here about saying, I like your framework, but I don't think we can avoid the very real discrimination that some minority groups face. What about truth and reconciliation, a sense of justice? That's the point of DEI, and this pluralism approach skips that completely, seemingly. So I think what this question is getting at is that ideas around, and I love the slide that you put up, by the way, around diversity is a treasure, identity, source of pride, cooperation, bridging, and so forth. I think what this question is getting at is how within that framework that's emphasizing cooperation and bridging, do we address the very deep, injustices, disparities, inequalities that continue to exist?
Yeah. So I think this is a really interesting and important question. And this is a important disagreement that I have with a lot of people in DEI. And I don't think it has to be a scornful one, but I'm going to be a robust advocate of my point of view. I think it is more important to speak of pride in people's identities and people's potential than it is about the barriers that they face. I'm going to say it again. I think it is more important to speak about the pride that people have in their identities and the potential that they have that can be nurtured than it is to speak about the barriers that they face. Now, I don't mean 100 and 0, right? Maybe I mean 70-30. And it's a matter of emphasis. But I think it's interesting to look at some data here. My view on this is coming partially out of being in diversity work for 25 years. It is coming out of social science data. And it's coming out of, having kids in school, 14 and 17 years old, where they're constantly asked how they're victims. I'm going to say that again. My kids in the Chicago public schools, brown kids, are constantly asked by well-meaning people, frankly, well-meaning white people, how they're victims. And what they really want is what coaches tell them, which is the only bar here is excellence, and we work hard to achieve it. That's what their coaches tell them. Right? And what's interesting is they voluntarily participate in a number of diversity programs. I want people to hear this. I want people to hear this. They come home and tell me the only thing that those facilitators want to know is how I'm a victim of Islamophobia. Like literally, when I start talking about how I'm inspired by Islam, they cut me off. They like me more when I'm a victim. So now this isn't every diversity space. That is not my accusation. But when we treat barriers as more important than potential, we tell people we like them more when they're victims. And what is really interesting is if you look at the social science data on this, the percentage of African Americans and Latinos, I'm an Asian American, okay, so these are not my groups, but the percentage of African Americans and Latinos who say things like, you can achieve your goals if you work hard. America is the greatest country on earth. The questions that connect personal potential and national pride, African Americans and Latinos have a far higher rate of believing in personal potential and national pride than white progressives. That is social science data. So if you are following the data, 75 to 80% of Latinos say that they believe America is the greatest country on earth and that they can get ahead if they try. 60% of African Americans believe that America is the greatest country on earth and that they can get ahead if they try. Only 25% of white progressives believe that. So it's an interesting question to ask. If the theme of your program is all of the reasons you can't get ahead, which demographic group are you appealing to?
Great, thanks, Deepu. And there's another question in here about employee resource groups or affinity groups, right? Many of the organizations we work with have groups that employees can join based on their racial identity, their sexual orientation, disability, and so forth. What are your thoughts about these affinity groups? Do they support building community and safe space in organizations, or do they create division rather than cooperation? And if I can add to that, I've heard a lot more recently from organizations who have launched religious themed affinity groups, whether that be, you know, a Jewish employees affinity group or a Muslim employees affinity group and the like, or even launching interfaith affinity groups in their workplace. So yeah, what are your thoughts about affinity groups?
Yeah. A friend who's a congressperson said Ken Burns came and spoke to Congress, and he said, part of our problem right now is we have more pluribus than unum. We have more pluribus than unum. So I love affinity groups. I love diversity. And it is the job of a company to embrace diversity and to encourage cooperation. It's a job of a campus to embrace diversity and encourage cooperation. So let's have those affinity groups. People's identities are really important to them. I will say it again. Identity is principally a source of pride. The vast majority of people relate to their identity as a source of pride, not as a status of victimization. I'm going to say that again. The vast majority of people relate to their identity as a source of pride, not a status of victimization. We should encourage those groups organized around pride, because as people are encouraged to have pride in their identity, they're more optimistic, they engage better, they do better in class, they do better in the athletic field, they do better at their companies. And then we should make sure we encourage cooperation. So we are looking at what Robert Putnam would call bridged social capital. You have your diverse groups, and then they're constantly working together. Think about a potluck. Think about a potluck. You might very well have certain groups of people gather pre-potluck to cook the food that they cook together, right? It's always more fun to make biryani with a group of other South Asians than to do it alone. Okay, so you might have people gather, but then you come to the common table, and then you share, and then you cooperate, and then you engage, and you converse. That's the model here. So encourage the affinity groups, but not in silos, in cooperation.
And do you also, in the workplace context, another person is asking about if you have any recommendations for fostering mentorship across diverse lines, such that those on either side of that line feel comfortable communicating freely and authentically with one another?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting and sticky. So if if we're going to do real talk here, right? There are things that people said to me 20 years ago that are harder to say to people where I was 20 years ago. So I'm going to tell personal stories. Okay. The people who changed my life were the people who said, "You're not doing this well enough. No excuses. You're not doing this well enough." I had a professor tell me people would listen to you more if you weren't such a jerk. The first people who gave the organization I lead grants, we're now a $20 million organization, but we started with a $35,000 check from the Ford Foundation and a $40,000 check from the Chicago Community Trust. So every one of those first 3 people who gave us our first initial grants were people of color. I do not think that that is a coincidence. 2 African-American men and a South Asian Muslim woman. And when they handed that first check to me, they said, you are not ready. Like, your organization is not at the place where we normally give grants, but I see something in you and we're looking to diversify our portfolio. So I'm going to make an investment in you and you are not going to make a fool of me. I went to the wall for you in a meeting and you are going to succeed. And I didn't look at that and think to myself, you are oppressing me because of your expectations. I thought to myself, the standard is high and I have to rise to it. And I am not going to let this person down. I am not going to let this person who believed in me down. That is mentoring. And if we're honest, it's harder today. Ask yourselves this. Do you say that to people? If you are, as I am, a mid-career professional, go back in your own memory and ask yourself the question, what were the turning points in my career? My wild guess is it had to do with somebody who you admired pulling you aside and saying, it's not good enough. It's not good enough. You got to do better. And you did. That's why you are where you are. And if you're a younger person, ask yourself the question. If you want to get really good at something, and by the way, there is no substitute for being good at something. There's no substitute. Telling people why you can't be good at something is not a substitute for being good at something. If you want to be a pilot, you have to learn how to fly a plane. There is no greater satisfaction in life than being good at something. Well, how do you get good at something? Partially, people tell you you're not good enough, and then they help support you to get good enough. That's a lot of what mentoring is. That's a lot of what mentoring is.
Well, Ibu, I feel like you have given us exactly that kind of mentorship today in helping us learn and grow and think critically about what we're not doing well to advance these values that we all share of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your wisdom and expertise and knowledge with us. I really appreciate it. You've given us a lot to think about in the weeks, months, and years ahead. So thank you again for participating, Ibu, and thank you all for joining.
Right. Thank you.
Take care.
Don't be afraid of anybody to reach out. My email is on the earlier slides. Thanks so much.
Wonderful, Ibu. Take care.
Bye-bye.